Is there such a thing as good food and bad food, or good drinks and bad drinks? Let's settle it. My name is Ben Case with Case by Case Training. And, there's two sides of the spectrum oftentimes when we're talking about good food and bad food. You've got people on the one side that it's very confusing ultimately, because they really try to camp things into good and bad. And then you've got the other side where, they would say, well, food has no morality. There's no such thing as good and bad food. Now, I kind of understand both sides, because this side, really what they're talking about is the nutritional value of food. They're not saying like food is good or bad, like it's naughty or nice. Really, they're talking about the nutritional value of food. There's some foods that are more nutritionally valuable and some that have either little to no nutritional value. And that's kind of how they are categorizing it. Over here, I also understand and probably tend to agree with a little more that yes, there is nutritional value to food. However, it really comes down to the amounts of the foods that you're having. This is where these people usually land that say, well, food has no morality. They don't just say, typically, they don't just say, do whatever you want. Food doesn't have any different effect. You can eat whatever you want as much as you want. The point that they would typically make on this side would be, no, you just have to have moderation, and certain things you can have more of if it's more nutritionally valuable, and certain things you shouldn't have quite as much of, but it doesn't mean you can't have any of it. No! I would tend to agree more with this side, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why. First off, my question over here to the people who would say, there's good and there's bad. Are you really set on only having food that is nutritionally valuable? Always. And at what point do you have to go, can't have that, even though maybe it's nutritionally valuable, because it's got something else that's not nutritionally valuable with it? If it's an apple and it's covered in chocolate, is it no longer nutritionally valuable? The apple didn't lose any of the nutrients. It's just now covered in something that isn't nutritionally valuable. Does that make it a bad food? And so where it can get confusing sometimes is people try to, again, categorize good and bad foods, but then you start getting things that are good foods but have some bad things added to them, which is a lot of things. And whether it could even be like, well, if they're sprayed with pesticides, or if they've got, any kind of added sugars, or if they have artificial sweeteners, or the list goes on of things that get lumped into the bad category. And so, I would argue that you're going to be really hard pressed to only eat foods and things that have nothing that you consider to be quote unquote bad added into them in any way, shape, or form. But the bigger thing that I would say, even if you could possibly do that, and more power to you, I suppose. My question though is, what makes it bad? What makes chocolate bad? What makes sugar bad? What makes artificial sweetener bad? What makes any of the things bad? Well, again, it's the nutritional value, right? Well, it's not nutritionally valuable to me, or it's not as nutritionally valuable as these items over here. So therefore, we lump them into the bad category. So here's the thing. What makes it bad though? If it has no nutritional value, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It's bad when it starts to have a negative effect, right? And so, yes, non-nutritionally valuable foods will more quickly and more easily start to have negative effects if you have too much of them, versus nutritionally valuable foods. You can typically have a lot more. Doesn't mean, though, they can't still have adverse effects if they're out of balance, or if you have too much of stuff. Water is not really nutritionally valuable on the scale. It's essential, but you can also have too much of it, and it can be bad. You can have a lot of it before it's bad, and certain things you can't have very much of before they start having negative side effects, right? But if you're not having them in excess and you're just having small amounts of these things, what about that is bad? Any more than the nutritionally valuable food that you're eating the right amount of. Yes, just because you can afford to eat more of it before it becomes negative and has negative side effects doesn't mean that it's potentially any less bad. So what I would say is that all food has the potential to be bad, and all food has the potential to be beneficial in some way, even if it's not always nutritional benefit. Foods that aren't always nutritionally beneficial can still have other benefits. Now, a lot of people have a genuine issue of not being able to eat things in moderation, and they're excessive with the things that are less nutritionally valuable. And that's a problem, and they need to work on having more of the nutritionally valuable foods and less of the non-nutritionally valuable foods. But that doesn't mean that it's all bad or all good. Again, it comes down to the amounts that we're consuming. And understanding the amounts that you can have before something becomes negative is important, because even with the nutritionally valuable foods, there are certain ones that you can have a lot less of before you start having some negative side effects. You think of something that's way more calorie dense, like a handful of nuts. If you just eat nuts all day, which a lot of people get confused because they think, well, I'm eating the healthy foods over here. And so they think they can just eat an infinite amount of them and be okay. And they eat a lot of things that are very, very high in calories, and they don't realize it. And they're snacking all day. They're not feeling full, and they're gaining weight. And they're confused because they're eating good food and avoiding the bad food. And then there's people who recognize that, well, there's not really good and bad food. It's just, I've got to get a good amount of the nutritionally valuable food and the food that fills you up more, so I can also still enjoy some of these things over here in moderation and in the proper amounts before they're bad and negative. And they still get results, they lose weight, and they live a happy, healthy life. And you might say, well, yeah, but that's more difficult. It's harder. Is it really? Because it seems really confusing to me and really difficult to try to categorize all the what's good, what's bad, and you can only have this and nothing added to it. It's very, very strict. And it also seems to run into inconsistencies at times, because we got like the good and the bad, but then sometimes this thing has that in it, and well, it's not bad in this instance because of this reason. And usually the reason is moderation, which, wouldn't you know, that's exactly the whole point, is that yes, in moderation, things aren't necessarily bad for you. It's just knowing what the amounts are that you can have. A good example of this is artificial sweeteners, which, by the way, people think are so unhealthy, and yet the amount that you would have to have before it starts having negative side effects on your health is crazy. Nobody's out there consuming the amount of artificial sweetener that you would need to take in before it starts being negative and having bad side effects on you. Which is funny, because simply because it can have a negative side effect if you have too much of it, it's touted as, oh, it's bad for you. Stay away from it, avoid it. Again, well, are you going to apply that to everything? Are you going to apply that to anything that could be bad for you if you have too much of it? Because guess what? That's everything. That literally includes everything. Instead of saying something is bad because if you have too much of it, it's going to be unhealthy for you, which duh, let's start thinking about, well, how much, and let's start making that more available to people and helping people understand the amounts of things that they can have, and at what point do things start to have negative side effects. Because if people really understood that, it would help them make better decisions. It would help them to be more clear and not think of food so much in the category of good or bad, but think about it in the category of, how much of this can I afford to have? How much of this can I afford to have? And yes, you're going to be able to afford to have a lot more of the foods that are nutritionally beneficial, and you're going to be able to have a lot less of the foods that have no nutritional benefit. But that doesn't mean you can't have any of them and that you just can't have anything that you enjoy anymore. Just means we need to understand, what are the amounts, how much is too much, and that's just not readily available. It just really becomes more good versus bad, instead of, hey, here's how much of this is bad, here's how much of this is bad, and understanding that. It's artificially sweetened. Oh no. Oh, one other ironic thing, just to end the video. All the fuss that people give about something like this. And yet, my question is, do you drink any alcohol? It's like the number one carcinogen. And by the way, still not bad for you in moderation, but the amount you can have before it starts becoming bad is a lot less than what most people probably drink. So just saying, if you're trying to be consistent, think through if you really are, and maybe you're just actually okay with things in moderation, and so you just need to stop saying that certain things are bad or not, and recognize it does come down to moderation.